be a redundancy right there. for many of us, right? I'm looking at Wendy's very complete CV here. There's a lot of stuff. I mean, I think she's one of our area's favorite go-to experts. So she's asked to give a lot of lectures, and her voice, her mellifluous voice, is often heard on NPR in the mornings discussing. Are you going to be on tap again for
next week?
Next week, yeah. So this is her busy season. So we're lucky to get her now before everything hits the fan, and she's.
What hasn't already?
Yeah. I noticed here too that she regularly teaches a course called Fascism and Socialism, which might become relevant given some scenarios that might come through. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my very special friend who was part of my entry class at St. Norbert College, Assistant Professor of Political Science here at St. Norbert College. She's going to inform us. Thank you.
Thanks everybody for coming. I'm going to try to talk about this enormous field, and probably what you'll come away with is, wow, that's a mess. Which is pretty much it. The first thing I'm going to talk about is kind of the research journey, because this is my sabbatical talk. And so I get distracted a lot, which is a good thing that I'm at a liberal arts college. Because like, ooh, shiny. But in political science, we steal from everybody, basically. And so English, yeah, you name it, we steal it. And so that everything's connected to everything else. It's very hard to explain a lot of the concepts about what's going on in the political arena without sort of grasping these different and new parts. The impetus for the whole project itself was, as Lori just mentioned, I do a lot of public speaking, and everybody's always saying, oh my gosh, things are just so bad now. They've never been this bad before. And so I have my two-word things. First one, Civil War. And second, Boko Haram. So people are like, oh my God, things are so bad now. Which really, it just shows you that Americans, as we all know, Marty, very much so, that we are incredibly ahistorical. And Amy, right? So that's really important. And what's interesting too is it's not only left out of the public discussion, but it's also in large part left out of the academic discussion on polarization too. So a lot of times you are hearing the academics saying, it's really, really bad now, it's worse than ever. And you're like, well, what's the time period that you actually studied? Oh, 1970s forward. So yeah, they kind of forget the end part of that. So that's really important to remember, is context, is both the historical US context as well as actual extremism that's going on in the world versus what's going on with Democrats and Republicans. And so while, yeah, a lot of people are freaked out by the current political milieu, yeah, it's not anywhere near where it is even in Europe, for example, where next week my students are going to be starting their simulation on the European Parliament, where they're going to talk about the rise of both right-wing, speaking of fascism, right-wing political groups, as well as the radicalization of Islamist groups in Europe as well. So yeah, that's extreme politics. And we have some of that in the United States, but it's not anywhere near on the scale that it is even in Western European countries. So we have to keep that in mind, sort of not get freaked out about where we are. Hence the title of my talk. So actually the first part of my project already veered away, and that was to develop the class that I have taught several times now on global political extremism. And it really just came about because people kept saying, oh my God, things are so bad here. Like, no, look at the rest of the world, people. And we also needed another international relations course. So that actually is where that course came from. And it's actually a pretty popular class, and the students really seem to like it. And certainly I feel like it's a very important class to be talking about, but it always is giving me that context. The problem with that class, of course, is that it changes every 5 minutes. So, of course, over spring break, when we had the the Brussels bums, like, oh, guess what, classes changed on Monday. The first semester in the fall, when I was teaching in the fall, of course, we had Paris and San Bernardino right in the middle of the semester, and that's pretty normal, unfortunately. But, so that class has become a huge part of the overall picture on American polarization. As you said, I teach a Western ideologies course, which does look at fascism, socialism, communism, and looking at the differences, also democracy, big L, as I call it, big L liberalism, which is classical liberalism, and then as well as, well, how do we get from big L liberalism to current conservatism and current little L liberalism? And to me, this is all sort of a part and parcel to the same thing, and that people can have different beliefs and values based on these ideologies, and that can oftentimes lead to polarization when you're saying, all right, well, I have a different view from you. How much do you start to dislike that person? And this is a continuum to go from this basic ideological belief to a polarization where you're maybe more extreme in that ideological belief, and maybe starting the hate going on, to extremism where you've moved even further out and where actual hate is, and then of course ultimately to terrorism and war. So I think all the classes that I teach are really connected in that way. But one of the things that kept bugging me was particularly when we have some of the mass shootings that aren't necessarily terrorism. Terrorism is defined as having a political motive. So movie theater bomb, or just not too long ago, we had a guy who a foiled plot in Milwaukee who was going to shoot up one of the Mason temples. And that's a big conspiracy theory. And that, to me, is a big piece of what's missing from all of these, is what role does conspiracy theory play in that? So that was another ooh, shiny moment, and another class. So I taught that over, the first time I taught that was over this last J term. I piloted the class. I had 3 really, really good students in it. I was so lucky. You guys are going to be super jealous because they were good. They showed up every day, really prepared, really excited. Every piece of work they did was good. So that was awesome. And at the end, because they knew I was piloting the class, they gave me really, really good feedback on how to kind of proceed forward. The other good thing about that is that it's a really sneaky way to get in social science research methods, because Jamie, as we know, right, they're scared of it and they don't like it. But if you can say like, hey, the moon landing was faked, get them in that way. But the book that I use is actually an empirical test of the public and how it changes over time in beliefs in different kinds of conspiracy theories, and kind of looking at why they do and what eras of US history were more likely to have people believing in different conspiracy theories and that kind of thing. So it's a really interesting class, and I think it's also really valuable in terms of getting in those social science research methods. So I'm hoping to continue to sort of prep that class and read more about that and teach that again. So that was another kind of related but shiny conspiracy theories. But hopefully I think that will be a valuable addition to the political science offerings. But to the polarization actual literature, it is a mess. It is absolutely insane. I don't know about your guys' field, but they seem to be doing less and less lit review. So, it's like, why aren't you guys talking to each other? Why haven't you reviewed somebody else's thing? And I was discussing on a panel, and this person was talking about sort of environmental psychology, and I said, you know, there's a whole field of environmental psychology. She's like, there is? Wow. If you'd done any lit review, you would have found it pretty quickly. But so that was really weird to me. I don't know what's going on in grad schools with not teaching lit reviews. But in this case in particular, if you go onto Amazon, you will find more than 100 books that directly relate to American political polarization. And very few of them are actually in conversation with each other. So that was kind of my biggest problem. It was like, oh, well, there's a lot of literature. Somebody's got to have sort of organized it and looked at it. There is zero organization of this field. So that's kind of led me to this 3-book project that I've been kind of working with a couple of different publishers on that are interested in it, because obviously it's a pretty hot field. One is to actually do that lit review and to organize the field. And I'll show you at the very end what my basement looks like. It's kind of just a listing of all the different file boxes and files that I have that are trying to then put those pieces together as to what this beast of polarization is actually about, because it's basically all over the place. The other thing that I found in reviewing the literature that I did was that there is not a single textbook that is not argument-oriented. And those of you have used argument-oriented textbooks versus sort of the mainstream Intro SoS, Intro American History, Intro Class, there's like, here's the different arguments and here's the different sections. There is not a single one in American political polarization. Every single one of them has an argument to be made with it. And as we know, especially for intro classes, that's really difficult to teach those kinds of books, because it's hard for them to kind of like, well, what's the other side? And you're trying to get them to sort of critically think, but it's really, really difficult to do that. Plus, those are usually pretty narrow. They don't look at a lot of different aspects of it. So that's the other thing I'm looking at. That people are also really interested, because, as I said, there are none, and there are more schools and academics who are thinking about teaching courses along the lines of American political polarization. Last one is sort of more of a research-oriented book, and sort of some of the ideas that I have. I'll show you a little bit of those, some of the data at the end. But the basic premise is that what I found, especially using Wisconsin data, is that if it's a big general sort of knee-jerk reaction to a thing like, you ask somebody about the Affordable Care Act, they're gonna be much more polarized than when you ask them the details of the policy. And that has a lot to do with some of the concepts that I'm gonna talk about a little bit later. The other thing that's really weird is that almost all of the literature talks about polarization in terms of partisanship. Instead of, hey, are people divided based on gender or race? Now, obviously, we have literature on the politics of gender and politics of race. Again, what's weird about that, and I did this, I had a student that I was doing a joint research project with, and she's now continuing that project in her PhD program at Arizona. But we were kind of trying to find this link between gender and politics and the polarization literature. Again, they're not talking to each other. It's really weird. But as we can see, particularly in this election cycle, that there's quite a bit of polarization based on gender. So I think some of those demographic groups really need to be explored, and those literatures need to start talking to each other. So the question everybody wants to know, how bad is it? It's really bad. We're all going to die. Well, the answer, as always, in most of our fields is, well, it depends. And it really depends on who, where, what, how, why, and when. And notice I didn't start with what, and that's because it really depends. So we'll talk a little bit about each of these and give you a brief overview of kind of where I think the field is. So the first one is the who and the where. And there's a lot of literature talking about elected officials, which they call elites. I think we call it mass elite, which I think it's a leftover from the 1950s, and they just never changed those terms. But yeah, for some reason, that's what people are using. But what they mean by that are elected officials. At the national level in Congress, it's pretty settled, and this shouldn't be a surprise, that Congress is super polarized. And that this is a current era of polarization, because again, polarization is not new. It's not like Congress has never been polarized before. But are they very polarized right now? Yes, they are. And that trend has its roots in the 50s, we'll talk a little bit more about later, but mainly starting in the 1970s. So any of those sorts of theories who are blaming on George W. Bush or even on Clinton, you can really see the divide, the polarization starting quite a bit before that. So certainly those are exacerbating factors, but they're not causal factors of a current era of polarization. thing to remember too then is asymmetric versus symmetric polarization, which means is one side doing it more than the other? That would be asymmetric. Or are they both moving apart? Are conservatives moving to the right at sort of the same pace as Democrats are moving to the left? And again, the answer is, it depends. Yeah. What we find in Congress is asymmetric, that Republicans are moving much further right, and they've measured this doing what we call roll call votes, which is when they actually push those little buttons to vote rather than the voice votes, so we can tell on which issue, on where it is on the ideological scale, and how much they're voting for that. There's very little disagreement in the literature that the National Congress is polarized and they are asymmetrically polarized. But when you look at it at the state level, you have a really wide variety that some states really aren't polarized. Wisconsin is polarized, duh, but what's interesting about that, the studies that have been done at the state legislative level find that Wisconsin, for example, actually has symmetric polarization. So all the media attention, it's all Walker, it's all the Republicans. If you were just to read the paper, you would think we have asymmetric and very, very high polarization. We do have pretty high polarization. We're the 6th highest polarized state in the United States right now. California is by far, there's this huge outlier of polarization. And Jamie was a fellow West Coaster and wouldn't be surprised that with the mountains that go down the West Coast, you have quite liberal populations on the coastal parts, and then when you go on the other side of the mountains, they tend to be pretty conservative. So it's not surprising that California and Washington in particular are very high on the polarization scale. But Wisconsin's right up there, but I think what's surprising is that symmetric polarization rather than having it be all the Republicans' fault, as you might see in there. Local is very, very, we have 88,000 governments in the United States around that. Developing new ones every day as we incorporate new areas and areas break off from one another. So, right, is your local school board polarized? Maybe, but the school district on the other side of the river, which is weird, might not be. So we have to keep that in mind, because one of the things that I tell my students in the intro class is I never want to hear you say the government. Because who are you talking about? Any one of those 88,000 governments you might be talking about. And even within that, are you talking about the executive part, the legislative part, the judicial part, the bureaucratic part? Who are you talking about? So it's really important to remember that where part of it as what level of government and which state you're looking at. Interest groups. Koch brothers, right? Do they contribute? They're unlike the elites at the national level where it's like, yep, they're polarized and it's asymmetric. There is a huge disagreement about how much power some of these very, very large PACs and super PACs have. And certainly one of the arguments about why we're in this era of polarization and why it's gotten so much worse is the judicial decisions on campaign finance, which have loosened up those laws quite a bit. But it's also important to remember that, again, this particular era of polarization started in the 1970s, and of course that was a 2010 Supreme Court decision, so it's quite a bit after it already started. Did it exacerbate it? Probably, but again, the literature is really all over the place. Then we have the various different publics. What we do know, and again, it's fairly agreed upon, is that the party activists, and particularly the delegates, those that are actually going to go to the convention, and this is really important, we've been talking about this a lot in class, of course. What does it mean to have a contested convention? Again, very important to remember that prior to 1960, a contested convention wouldn't have been that weird. I'm like, well, it's kind of normal, so big deal. But now we're like, oh my God, it hasn't happened since 1964. So yeah, get over it. It's not that unusual. Okay. So the question is, how much do the party delegates matter? And again, people are all over the place. There are some scholars that actually say the entire fault for the current era of polarization is the party activists. It's their fault. And part of that, the argument that they make is the opening up of the primary system, that as we've gotten rid of the political boss era, that the party leaders have less power over the nomination process, that has opened up the power of the delegates and the party activists to have more power. What we do know about them, and again, this is an area where there's very little disagreement, is that they are significantly different than the rest of the voting population. They're on the same issues, they are more extreme, and they also care about different issues. So when they're the ones that are ultimately casting those votes, and also writing the party platforms, they are more extreme. But also it's important to remember that they care about different issues too. It's not just their extremity. So this kind of is getting at a bunch of different ways that you can measure polarization. The voting public is really, that's mostly where people are focusing, but what about the non-voting public? And meaning those that could vote but don't. And where are they in this? And largely they're not being discussed in this discussion, which is, I think, problematic. We use, in the data that we use in Wisconsin in non-election years, we actually don't use registered voter polls. We only do that in election years. So we actually have some data on the entire population. So we can ask, when we've asked about vote choice, we can separate some of those things out. And again, this is where a lot of these other demographic variables, there is some talk about regional differences. In particular, there's some discussion about rural areas and how that's causing some of the polarization. That's particularly true in Wisconsin, where we talk about some of those issues of difference of different regions within the state, and also the difference between particularly urban and rural. But I think there still needs to be a lot more comparison and incorporation of these different